be reading from John, there you go. John 13, 1 through 17. In the Pew Bible, it's 846. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of the world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that his Father had given all the things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. He then poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and wiped them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? Jesus answered, What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterwards you will understand. Peter said to him, You shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered, If I do not wash you, you have no share with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, The one who has bathed does not need to wash, except for his feet, but is completely clean, and you are clean, but not every one of you are. For he knew who was to betray him. That was why he said, Not all of you are clean. When he had finished washing their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and your teacher, have washed your feet, you also to wash others' feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than the master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them.
So how many of us have ever been burned in a relationship? How many of us have ever invested our time, our energy, maybe our finances into a relationship and gotten burned? Maybe it was a professional relationship. Maybe you went into business with someone, and so you gave of yourself, like day in and day out, working together with this business partner. You gave your time, you gave your money. To a certain extent, even your financial well-being was placed in their hands. And then things just went wrong. Maybe they stabbed you in the back. Maybe they left you out to dry. Maybe they took advantage of you and you were burned. How many of us have been burned in a romantic relationship? Right, you find someone whom, again, you invest your time, your energy, your very self, like who you are. You invest that in this relationship, and then you get burned. Today we are continuing in a series we began last week. It's a 3-week series, called Core, and the idea is we're looking at the core values of the church. What are those things that we hope are at the very core of who we are? If we get beneath the surface, right? Like on the surface, you could say a number of different things. We say, well, on the surface, we are a church that meets at 10620 Washington Street. We meet at 10 o'clock. We have a little yellow star as our logo, Calvary. Right? I mean, there's certain things you could just kind of say about us on the surface. We have great donuts on the back, right? You know what I'm talking about? Right? These are all great things that, that church on Washington Street. I know the church that you're talking about. Those are all things that are on the surface. But what's at the core of who we are? And it's important for us to revisit this. It's important for us to revisit what we hope is increasingly true of who we are at the very core, what's beneath the surface. And last week, we looked at really what I would say is the core value of our core values, right? Last week, we looked at what I would say is if you're just going to reduce it to one value, it would be what we looked at last week. And if you're going to sum it up in one word, I'd sum it up with this one word: grace. Grace, the grace of God ought to be at the very core of who we are. God's love for us, this unmerited favor that he lavishes on each and every one of us. That when God looks at you, he sees someone that he loves more than you can possibly imagine. Right? Like when you look in the mirror, I don't know what you see. Maybe when you look in the mirror, you see somebody who just got passed over for a promotion at work. Maybe when you look in the mirror, you see somebody who is maybe entrenched in some sort of behavioral pattern that just keeps causing damage to you and those around you. Maybe when you look in the mirror, you see a lot of shame. Friends, the heart of the gospel is that is not what God sees when he looks at you. The heart of the Christian faith is that we have a God of grace, a God who loves us, not on the basis of anything that we do, but entirely on the basis of his love for us. Our worth and our value is in the fact that we are children of God. That's the value. That's the core value of core values. And what's interesting is we see this incredible outpouring of God's love for us. It emerges in the passage that was just read as well. Actually, when we look at this passage, we see the grace of God. We see the heart of the good news, the gospel. And what we see in it is a window into, a glimpse of who God is. Right? What I like to say when people ask me, what is Christianity all about? If you were to sum up Christianity in a nutshell, well, I could say it's about the grace of God. That would be one way of saying it. But another way of saying it is this. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. That's it. Right? What is God like? People are like, what is God like? Well, I can tell you what God is like. Just look at Jesus. If you look at Jesus, then you'll see what God is like. And of course, when you do that, it's remarkable what you discover. Look at this here in John chapter 13, which was just read. Let me read these few verses here, verses 3 through 5. These are some of my favorite verses in the Bible. To me, one of the most profound truths in the universe emerges from these verses here. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. I want you to think about the sort of juxtaposition of ideas that emerges in these few verses. So remarkable, so counterintuitive. Look at the beginning. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands. Okay, so here he's revisiting the idea, right, of his divine nature. That his oneness with the Father, he has control over all things. If we go back to the beginning of the Gospel of John, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And when it talks about the Word, we've discovered that it's referring to Jesus. And then it says all things were made through him, right? So Jesus, all things were made through him. He is one with God. He is divine, that great mystery of the Trinity. Jesus, one with the Father. All things were created through him. He has control over all things. And in this moment in Jesus' earthly ministry, he's being reminded of that. He's reflecting on the fact that he has control over all things. He's reflecting on the fact that he has control over the orbit of the planets. He has control over the weather. He has control whether it's going to rain, whether it's going to be sunny. He could do whatever he wants with any of that. He has complete control over all things. That's what he's thinking about, okay? And so as he's ruminating on the fact that he has control over all things, what then is his response to that realization? He becomes a servant. At the very moment in which he reflects on the enormity of his power. How does he choose to use that power? He becomes a servant. He laid aside his outer garments and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with a towel that was wrapped around him. Friends, right there, I mean, that right there ought to change the way we see everything. The God of the universe, what does he do with his power? He empties it in this act of service. That's what he is. He's a God of self-giving, sacrificial love. He's a God of grace. That's just the beginning here. We could go on with that. We could just make that the sermon. But actually, there's more I want us to see from here, because I think then what this passage then helps us to address, what emerges then from this passage is another question. And that is, in light of that, in light of the grace of God, we might ask ourselves, how does the grace of God uniquely shape community? So in other words, if that really is the foundational principle of who God is and the God that we worship, the grace of God, how is this going to shape community that is oriented around that? And I think one of the principles that emerges from this passage, there's a lot we could say about that, but from this passage I want to highlight this. Grace creates community where people are willing to let others into their lives. Grace creates an atmosphere and a forum where people are willing to let others into their lives. It creates an environment where we're willing to let one another in between our toes. The vulnerability of letting somebody in between your toes, right? I mean, think about what Jesus does here. He washes their feet. Now, as we'll see, washing somebody's feet is an act of humility, right? There's a vulnerability in choosing to wash somebody's feet. But let's be honest, like getting your feet washed is kind of humbling, right? And there's a vulnerability involved in allowing somebody to wash your feet. And of course, why is that? It's because, well, let's be honest. Feet at their best are mundane, and at their worst, feet can be quite nasty. Right? But the best they're ever going to be is mundane. How many of us here, you don't actually have to raise your hand. You can if you want. I mean, if you want to be vulnerable, that's fine. How many of us here have ever used an online dating service? Right? Okay, you don't have to answer that. Well, I have. I used an online dating service. Actually, it was unbeknownst to me. When I was 30 years old, my mom was starting to wonder if, what's going on with my boy? Is he going to stay single his whole life? So she decided to take the initiative, and she filled out an eHarmony profile in my name and did the initial steps. Fortunately, while this was happening at the same time, I think God was like, okay, fine, let me take care of this, Jerry. Okay, let me take care of this. And brought Laura into my life, who, of course, now we've been married for 15 years. So my mom, she finally confessed that to me, I think, after she canceled the subscription or whatever. Right? Okay, but online dating service, my understanding is, and I know they're not all the same, but some of them, right? Like what you'll do is you'll look at a picture, and then there's like either you swipe right or you swipe left, right? Something like that. You swipe right, that means you're interested or something like that. If you swipe left, then you're not interested. So you're looking at this picture of them. Now, here's my guess, and I don't know because I haven't spent a lot of time on these, but my guess is that most of the time the picture that you're looking at is not of somebody's feet. Right? That's not what you lead with in a relationship, right? Right? I mean, most people like, I'm interested in, I don't know, I like blondes or, I like really, bulky, sturdy men or whatever. I like beards or I don't like beards. But you don't hear people talking about feet, you know what I mean? So you don't lead with your feet because feet, at their best, are mundane. and at their worst are kind of nasty. And so to let somebody wash your feet is a little bit vulnerable. And I think the reason Jesus chooses this to a certain extent, I mean, certainly within the ancient Near Eastern context, that they actually needed people to wash their feet, or they were always walking around in sandals and so whatnot. But I think he's pointing to something here. It is symbolic of a vulnerability, a willingness to be vulnerable with others. A willingness to let people in between your toes, right? Let people into your life. Let people into the challenges that you are facing, maybe at work. Let people into the challenges maybe you're facing in your marriage. Let people into the challenges that you're facing in your own mental and spiritual health. Like, it's letting people into those sort of vulnerable areas of our life is what I would suggest that this points to. And of course, it's interesting, right? Because Peter, the disciple Peter, at first he refuses, right, to have Jesus wash his feet. Look what he says. It says here, Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." And Jesus answered, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Now, Peter here, right, what he's thinking is, wait a minute, you are the Messiah, you are the king, the anointed king, right? I should be washing your feet, not you washing my feet, right? But he's missing, right? He's missing the whole hope of the gospel. Is that our God is a God who came to serve, not to be served. He came to lavish his love on us, that our love for him is always a response to the initiative love that he gives us. So Peter kind of misses this, and Jesus makes it clear, no, you have to get this. I have come, right, to love you and to meet you in that place of vulnerability. That's actually what it means to follow me. If you're going to follow me, you've got to allow me into the vulnerable places in your life. And this is, let's put it this way. God is most honored when we let him get between the toes. Think about that. How do we honor God the most? Right? It's not even necessarily through, trying to do good things and try. I mean, God appreciates when we do good works for him. But you know where it starts? The way we honor him, first and foremost, is by simply letting him into our lives. Letting him in between the toes. Letting him into the brokenness and the dark places, the uncomfortable places in our life. Jared Wilson puts it this way. He says, the gospel, the good news, the gospel is for sinners. The bar could not be set any lower. Anyone can qualify so long as we can get low enough. Right? So in order to receive God's grace, to receive his approval, it's not a matter of achieving something. It's not a matter of trying to get over some sort of a bar. It's actually the opposite. It's a willingness to go low. It's a willingness to be vulnerable. And in fact, that's the only way you can really experience the grace of God, is by going low, by being open, and by being vulnerable. Grace, in this sense, only extends to those who are willing to bring their stuff before God. There's vulnerability before God. Okay, but here is where it gets really uncomfortable. Because we see Jesus takes it a step farther. Grace only extends to those willing to be vulnerable before others. You see, it's not just about simply being vulnerable before God. There's got to be this willingness to be vulnerable before one another. We see that there's a sense in which he does in this passage is he sort of passes the torch. Right. So he says here, if I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. See this? Or just as you would bring your nasty feet before me, you need to be willing to bring your nasty feet before one another. In the book of James, it says it this way, a little more directly. Therefore, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. You see this? This idea that we need to be able to confess our sins before one another, and if we aren't able to do that, then we're not likely to be able to experience that healing. Now, if you're a good Protestant, alarm bells are going off right now here. Ding, 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 ding. Wait a minute. Are you saying that confession of sin has to go through an intermediary, right? I've got to go through somebody else in order for my confession to get to God? No, that is not at all what I'm saying. That's not what this is saying. And there are plenty of verses we could point out where it's clear. No, you go directly to God. That Jesus died, so you can go directly through him to God. We confess our sins to him. We don't need anybody other than him as an intermediary. I think what's going on here, I think the principle that emerges here is not so much theological as it is practical. And here's what I would suggest this is pointing to. Until you are willing to confess your sin to others, your confession probably isn't genuine. If you're not willing to bring it before others, there's a chance you're actually still just not really confessing it. You're still holding on to it. I found this in my own life. If I'm not willing to bring whatever vulnerability it is before others, it might be because I'm actually still just trying to hold on to it. I don't really want to let go of whatever it is. And so when we bring it for others, it brings it out in the open, and I think demonstrates the authenticity of that confession. So we see here, Jesus calling us to bring this before one another, a willingness to be vulnerable for one another. Grace-shaped community is where we let others into our lives. Now, at this point, when we start talking about community, and this is just sort of as an aside, a community requires intentionality. Right? Before we even get to this question of whether or not we're going to be vulnerable with one another, we actually have to be around one another to even get to that point, which is something that I think is somewhat unique in our modern age. And I feel like I have to highlight this every time we talk about community, that our modern age does not naturally facilitate community. In previous eras, community happened a whole lot more naturally. It just does not in our modern age. We could talk about just starting with the automobile and how the automobile segmented life. So you have your home life, and then your work life could be 30 miles away. So your community, you got community at home, you got community over there, but the potency of community is much less because you're in kind of both places. You see what I mean? So whereas before the automobile, everybody was you kind of worked and lived more in a local area, and so the people that you were around, it was a lot easier to sort of naturally get involved in community. So the automobile kind of messed that up. But then we talk about the television, right? Everybody used to kind of hang out, and everybody just sits at home and watches TV. We could talk about how people used to hang out on the front porch of their house and engage with their neighbors as they walked by. But now all the homes, they don't build front porches for people to sit on. What do? They build a back porch into a backyard so you can just hang out by yourself, right? And these are all things that in our modern world have made it difficult for community to happen naturally, which is why we have to be intentional about building community. That's just step one. But then once we have begun to engage in those relationships and sort of build that community, then we got to go that next step and say, okay, I'm willing to be vulnerable before one another in order to experience the grace that God desires for me to experience in my life. Okay, so what does grace do? Grace creates community, first of all, as we've seen, where we are willing to let others into our lives. Secondly, grace creates community where we are willing to get into the lives of others. Now, there's a willingness to invest in the lives of other people. And this is what's symbolized by this idea of washing another's feet. Washing somebody's feet symbolizes a willingness to get into, right, the messiness of another person's life. Now, I want to be careful here. We're not talking about being nosy. We're not talking about prying into somebody's life. We notice that Jesus does not wash everybody's feet throughout his ministry. He does not offer to wash Pontius Pilate's feet. He does not offer to wash the Pharisees' feet, right? He's not trying to pry, but those with whom he has community, those with whom he's built relationships, now what he's doing is he's willing to get involved in their lives. And, this has been thinking about over the last several months. We've been pushing what we're calling the discipleship initiative, a discipleship initiative, which is really an initiative where we're encouraging us to get involved in one another's lives. That what we've seen is that there are a number of folks who maybe are in a place in their life where they could use some guidance. They could see some help, whether it's young couples that could use some investment from those who are older, or whether it's just individuals who are maybe going through some difficult issues and could really use to be poured into by somebody else. This discipleship initiative, and what we're really just talking about is establishing relationships where we're willing to open up about life and allow the grace of God to bring healing in those relationships, to bring healing in those lives. So I want to just encourage you to think about that. I mean, maybe you're here today and the reality is you realize that there really aren't a lot of people who know you. And I would just suggest to you that maybe it's time to open up. And if you're interested in that, I would love for you to talk with me about that. Just start there. We can talk about what that might look like for you to get in a relationship maybe with somebody else who can walk through life with you, that sort of thing. This is part of what this whole discipleship initiative is all about. We need people on both sides. We need people who are willing to invest in the lives of others, and we need people who are willing to be honest about their need for the investment of others into their lives. This is what I would suggest Christian community is intended to look like. And this is what grace can help to create. Right? Grace creates community where we're willing to be vulnerable, let others into our lives, and grace creates community where we're willing to invest in the lives of others. That's two things. The third thing that grace does is this. Grace-shaped community seeks Jesus to help clean up the mess. And what I mean by this is this. Like I'm encouraging us to create community where we're willing to be vulnerable with one another. But here's the truth. If grace is not present in that community, being vulnerable is a terrible idea. If the grace of God isn't really what saturates those relationships, then opening up, being vulnerable is a terrible idea. Because if you open up, if you're vulnerable about what's going on in your life, and grace doesn't sit at the center of that community and that relationship, you know what'll happen? You just might get burned. You just might get burned. How many of us have ever had this before? You're vulnerable. You open up, and what you receive from those around you is not love, not compassion, but rather judgment. How many of us have been vulnerable before, and all we've experienced is judgment or condemnation? How many of us have been vulnerable before, and actually what it leads to is manipulation? Right? So you open up something about yourself, and now they just hold it over you. Ever had that? Someone just holds it over you, like, oh, I wouldn't want to admit this, because then people will just hold it over me. See, what's going on there? Grace is not present. When the grace of God is present, when the grace is there, and we realize, here's just the reality. When we realize, as it says in Romans 3, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. When we all realize, look, we're all a mess. That's just the truth. We're all a mess. Every single one of us. I never met anybody who isn't a mess. We are all a mess. And I really try to communicate this to people, because I've found sometimes people in the church, they're afraid to open up. And I always have to tell them, I'm like, look, listen to me. No matter what you tell me, you're not going to surprise me. You're not going to freak me out. Like, I'm not going to be like, whoa, I've never heard anything like that before. Believe me, that's just not the case. Try me out. Right? I'm serious. Right? Because the reality is we all have junk. We all have stuff. We all have sin. We've all been the victims of sin. We all have darkness in our lives. That's just the reality. But in an environment of grace, you see, now we can be vulnerable. Now we can open up and we can experience healing. Apart from grace, don't even think about opening up. But this ought to be what is at the heart of Christian community. Christian community allows us to open up. Also, apart from Christian community, apart from grace, I would suggest that it's dangerous to invest in the lives of others as well. Because here's the truth. Investing in the lives of other people is messy. Investing in the lives of others is hard work. It can be draining. And oftentimes you can go through it, and sometimes you'll feel unappreciated. Sometimes you'll feel taken advantage of. And apart from the grace of God, apart from a realization that that's what God has done for you, it'll wear you out. But when we rest in the grace of God, it enables us both to open up and to enable ourselves to invest in the lives of others. Friends, I just want to encourage you to think about what would it look like for you to allow others between the toes? What would it look like for you to be willing to get in between the toes of those who need your help? This is the kind of community that grace creates. And it's the kind of community where you can experience true healing. We now come to our time of communion. What is communion all about? Well, communion is an opportunity to point us back to the grace of God. Why do we take communion here at Calvary every week? To remind us of the grace of God. The heart of the Christian faith is that in Jesus Christ, God has come. Jesus died on the cross to forgive us of our sin. What Jesus was saying is, it doesn't matter how messy your life is. It doesn't matter what you do to me. You could kill me, and I still love you. That's the heart of the Christian faith. That whatever darkness we might have in our hearts and our lives, when we bring it before the cross, we experience grace. We experience the freedom and the love of God. And this enables us to extend that grace to those around us. The bread and the cup represent the body and the blood of Christ, pointing us to the grace of God.